This is EWA Radio, the official podcast of the Education Writers Association, and I'm public editor Emily Richmond. From Boston to Seattle, communities across the country are holding massive public protests in response to police brutality and the death of George Floyd, a Black man who died after a Minneapolis police officer knelt on his neck for nearly 9 minutes. Several officers involved in the incident now face charges, including murder. Adolfo Guzman-Lopez, a radio reporter for KPCC, Southern California Public Radio, is among the many education journalists who are covering the story. He was also injured on the job after being struck in the throat by a rubber bullet while covering a protest in Long Beach on May 31st. He joins us now. Adolfo, welcome to EWA Radio.
Thanks a lot for the invite. Happy to join you.
I want to start with the question that everyone has for you. How are you doing?
Oh, I'm doing a lot better. I went to the ER right after this happened, and they took a CAT scan, and they didn't find any damage to kind of the internal part of the throat. I at no point did I feel like my throat was constricting or I had trouble breathing, which is the main sign that something's wrong. So right now, it did open a little bit of a gash, and right now it's scabbing, which I think is all the details you need to know.
Well, you posted a tweet about it, a tweet that did go viral, which showed you injured and the bloody bruise mark on your throat. Tell us a little bit about what you remember about the incident. You were wrapping up an interview at the time, is that right?
That's right. I was assigned to cover a protest in Long Beach, California, which is where I live, so it was about 10 minutes away from my house. This was on Sunday, May 31st. And so I got to the intersection of 3rd and Pine in Long Beach. It's the downtown part of Long Beach. And sure enough, there were quite a few people, maybe about 100 people at the intersection. And so I had a couple of jobs. My job was to do a two-way with the newscast for our radio station and to describe what I was seeing. And that was going to happen real fast. So I only had a couple of minutes to look at the situation, describe it, make some notes, figure out what's important, and call back. So I did that a couple of times to master control at our radio station with our anchor. And then I started to interview some people. A couple of people said no to me. They didn't want to talk. And then I talked to an African-American man who was taking a knee in the middle of the street, kind of about 10 yards away from the crosswalk. And just as I was wrapping up the interview, I talked to him for a little over a minute, asked him why he was there, what message he wanted to get across, and that sort of thing. Just after I wrapped up that interview, I heard a pop from a distance from the police line, and a real strong pressure to the bottom of my throat. And I've been to protests, and I've actually been in protests where rubber bullets are fired. So whether it's instinct or experience, I knew I had an inkling of what it was, so I ran in the other direction.
Well, I'm obviously very glad that you did run in the other direction. I'm curious, do you think that the police officer had any idea who you were or what you were doing? I mean, you were wearing a press badge, and could you tell from a distance what you were doing, that you were media?
It's that's a question for the police officer, and so ultimately, he's the one to be able to answer, why he pointed the rubber bullet gun at me and fired. But I was wearing my press pass. The LA County press pass is a little bit nondescript. It used to be different fluorescent colors every year. It's no longer that, and it's smaller. So I could see how somebody looking at me would not be able to tell that I was a reporter. I was using my phone to interview because I had to get these interviews to the station quickly. So I used voice memos for that. And I didn't have any kind of vest that said press or media. I didn't have my headphones, which I usually have when I do radio recorded interviews. Didn't have my headphones or my microphone out. So it is possible that, somebody looking at me would not really know that I was a reporter.
Well, certainly there's been reporting across the country about journalists who have been intentionally targeted for violence at the hands sometimes of protesters and sometimes at the hands of police. I wanted to point out that you did receive an apology from the police department.
That's right, I did, both from the chief of police of the city of Long Beach and the mayor of the city of Long Beach. The mayor said that this shouldn't have happened, and they're investigating They're investigating the situation. So they've announced an internal investigation of a police department, internal investigation of the incident. So, that is running its course. So that was significant that both the mayor of Long Beach and the police chief of Long Beach came out pretty soon after and apologized and said that they wanted to get the details of why this happened.
Other than being injured at this particular protest, as you've said, you've covered them before, including some massive ones. Did anything seem different this time around? Was there anything different in the mood or the attitude of the people or the people you were talking with?
Absolutely. So, Los Angeles is a big city. LA County is a big county. It's a county of 10 million people. And if you add neighboring Orange County, that's another 3 million people. So I've covered labor marches. The big protests that I covered were around 2006, 2007, when there were high school students that walked out in support of immigrants' rights. And then in 2007, I covered a big immigrant rights protest where the LAPD cleared a park near downtown Los Angeles where a lot of protesters had gathered, and also a lot of news media had gathered to do their evening newscasts for that day, a lot of Spanish language media. And the LAPD announced by loudspeaker from a helicopter, only in English, that this was an unlawful assembly that people had to clear out. And then police officers in riot gear cleared everybody using rubber bullets. I didn't get hit that time, but I did pick up a couple of rubber bullets, so I've got those as souvenirs. And the police officers mowed over quite a few of the national newscast tents. So that was an incident that led to LAPD changes and reforms in how they announce an unlawful assembly, and also some of the policies and practices regarding the protests.
What steps did you take to prepare before you went out? I'm curious what you would say are some of the best practices for a journalist, especially maybe for an education journalist who hasn't been called out to cover something like this.
This topic has been very important in our newsroom as reporters have been sent out to cover these protests, and it's obvious that these protests are very different. At this protest in Long Beach, the dynamics and the energy was very different than other protests I've covered. So in previous protests, kind of the energy is similar. Most everybody is kind of there for one purpose, and maybe mostly labor union members or mostly students or, mostly immigrant rights activists, right? Just a broad characterization. And here, from that time that I was there at this protest, there seemed to be different groups. There seemed to be groups of people between 25 and 30 years old, maybe, who, were very in support of this message that police violence must stop. There were also groups of younger people, I'm making an assumption here, maybe not college educated, right, who were very vocal in their same kind of message, stop police brutality. And then there was another group of people who were very energetic. These were the people that I saw break into a couple of stores and take things and steal things. So what can you do to prepare? I didn't do enough. I should have worn some protection around my neck. So what I did is I put on some hiking shoes, put a backpack with a couple of bottles of water, some food, some power bars, an apple, that sort of thing, and the usual, my Marantz recorder, microphone, a couple of reporters' notebooks, and a couple of masks, for COVID-19 and all that. But yeah, I think in hindsight, I definitely would have wanted to have maybe, some identifying clothing or hat or something to that effect so that people would know that I'm a reporter out there doing my job.
I think that's a good point, especially in crowds this size, to think about that identifying clothing. I think these are also conversations that reporters should be having with their editors. I mean, I'm not sure they should need to try to figure all of this out on their own.
Oh, absolutely. We have a newsroom of over a dozen reporters, and we're being very vocal because our safety is on the line and our health is on the line. We are very committed to our reporting. We are very passionate about our reporting. We are very specialized at the KPCC newsroom, meaning that we have a housing reporter, we have 4 education reporters covering early childhood education, the K through 12 big district in LA, arts education, and I cover higher ed. So yeah, these are very important conversations because not everybody in our newsroom has had experience covering these kinds of news events. And, the contingencies are very important. So we're having those conversations right now. And yeah, the reporters at KPCC are pushing, our editors to, take action and help us better prepare.
We're talking with Adolfo Guzman-Lopez of Southern California Public Radio about how to approach coverage of public protests, as well as his long career on the education beat. Don't miss an episode of EWA Radio. You never have to. You can find us on your favorite podcast app. And don't forget to take a moment to rate us on iTunes. Your support and feedback are helping us grow. Adolfo, I want to turn to something you just said, which was the idea of getting prepared to cover these protests, because really we're talking about 2 things. We're talking about going out to the physical scene, but then also being prepared to cover the underlying issues and concerns and outrage that are fueling them. And that's another kind of category, isn't it?
It sure is. And that category requires you to have a background in your communities. So communities, plural, right? Because every city and county and region is made up of many different communities. In this situation with the current protests and marches, the communities that are being affected are African American communities, immigrant communities. And so a reporter and a newsroom must have good context and a good sense of what is going on in those communities regarding the quality of education, the level of unemployment. During COVID-19 and the quarantine, and it's been very clear that African American communities and Latino communities, immigrant communities, where there are people with lower income and maybe have higher incidences of conditions like diabetes and that sort of thing, are taking the brunt of COVID-19. So, for a reporter in a newsroom, it's important to understand to what extent these communities are going through some of these things, right? And also to have contacts in those communities, whether they be pastors in churches, whether they be immigrant rights advocates, whether they be even chapter chairs of teachers' unions at the large schools. Those are usually people who are very knowledgeable of those neighborhoods, even, principals at a school and or, presidents and staff at community colleges or the universities, the African American Studies departments at colleges and universities are good people to know and to talk to before going out. And just to ask those very broad questions, what are the residents of these neighborhoods going through? What's going on with them? What are you seeing? What are you hearing? And that'll prepare you to ask some questions, not only the broad questions of, okay, why are you out here? Why are you at this intersection of 3rd and Pine and Long Beach? Where do you live? Oh, I live in North Long Beach. Oh, I know a little bit about North Long Beach. There's some redevelopment and gentrification going on. Oh yeah, that's affected me. And then you can ask some follow-up questions about and give more of a nuance and context in your report as to what is bringing people to these protests.
I was talking with someone who's not in the news business about how many education reporters have been out in the field these past 10 days or so covering these protests. And someone said, well, why? It's not an education story. And my initial response was, of course it is.
Yeah, of course it is. It really is an education story in many different ways. Okay, so I've been a reporter at KPCC since October of 2000. So I would say the first maybe 7 to 10 years, I was general assignment reporter because there was a lot going on and there were only 3 reporters the first couple of years that KPCC changed formats and that sort of thing. So it was general assignment and we started adding reporters. So I covered the K-12, I covered the LA Unified School District. So the quality of education in some of the lower income areas of Los Angeles has been an issue for a long time. When I was out there at 3rd and Pine in Long Beach covering this protest, I'm thinking to myself, wow, these are people who are in their 20s, 20 to 30 years old maybe, mostly, right? wow, that means they were in school 10 years ago. I was covering schools 10 years ago. I was going to some of those high schools that had high dropout rates. To what extent did that impact their lives, some of these people's lives? Did they end up getting a job after high school? Did they end up getting into college after high school? When they went to college, to what extent did they connect with, if they're African American or Mexican American or Latino, Central American, that sort of thing? Did they connect with ethnic studies at their colleges? What impact did that have? Did that politicize them, mobilize them in some sort? These are the questions I have, and I think I'll be following up on some of these questions in the next few weeks.
Do you have a sense yet about how these protests might influence or shape anything related to higher ed policy in California, or what students might be experiencing this fall? I mean, obviously, we don't quite know yet what college is going to look like around the country, and that includes in California. But what is your sense right now?
Well, one of the questions that has come up for me is you've got a large number of high school graduates who've been accepted to colleges, right? And the dynamic in Southern California, and I think it holds true in many other parts of the country, is that especially for the state schools and for the community colleges, their students come from the surrounding areas. Southern California is a very dense urban area, so maybe within the 5-10-mile radius of the campus. So one of the questions I've had, and that I'm going to be putting out some calls on, is what are the campuses, both community colleges and the Cal State schools, which are the larger higher education institutions, what are they doing to prepare for this freshman class, this first-year class that's coming to them from after having graduated high school? Because it's going to be a very different fall than in previous years. The community colleges in California have already announced that they're going to be online almost entirely, as have the Cal State schools. So what are the administrators at those campuses doing to prepare those students? Because those students have to be prepared in some way or another. What happened to them in high school with the last 2 months of their senior year in terms of the tech, classes going online, doesn't seem to me enough of a preparation for what to expect for the online delivery of instruction in higher ed. So that may be a higher ed policy issue that either on a system-wide level with the Cal State universities or on a more campus-wide level, it would be interesting to find out what administrators are seeing, expecting, looking at, and doing to better educate these students once they start. Because as you and I know, a lot of students, that first year, the first semester, is very critical to students staying and graduating from a higher education institution.
What advice do you have for an education reporter who gets put on the story? Maybe, something to be careful about, to watch out for. People go into this with the best of intentions, and you want to do a good job covering this story. But are there things they should be mindful of in terms of even perhaps things like cultural competency?
That's a great question. Yeah. Open-ended questions, listen as much as possible. Talk to veteran reporters, I suppose, but then at the same time, if one of the younger reporters had come to me and asked me about these upcoming protests, oh, Adolfo, what should I know about, going out there? I don't know if I would have told that reporter what I knew about the previous protests, which are very different than these. So I don't know if my advice, maybe the basics of advice would have been, good, what to wear, what to take in terms of, kind of food and water and that sort of thing. Definitely talk to your news director. Definitely be open of any concerns that you have. And if you do have any concerns about your safety, if you do feel uncomfortable covering something, don't feel like you have to cover it because you're a reporter and that you have an obligation. Really, the obligation is to stay safe and be healthy and to continue doing your job. I've been doing my job from home. This assignment to cover the protest at Third and Pine was the first time I'd gone out in the field in over 2.5 months. And I've been writing stories and doing radio stories and the web versions of our stories. So you can do, a lot of reporters know, you can do stories from a desk. But if you have any concerns, tell your editor. And if you feel uncomfortable, even after talking to people, then, just don't do it. An editor should not think less of you, and that there should be no repercussions if you say, I don't feel comfortable going out to this protest. I don't want to go.
There been anything about this experience that surprised you? I mean, I'm sure you couldn't have ever imagined, well, what would happen to me if I was actually injured at one of these things, intentionally or not, whether or not you were the target. But has anything about this experience come as a surprise?
Well, today it's been Sunday, Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday. It's going to be 4 days since this happened. And it's been, the physical part of it has been manageable, I think, right? But the emotional part of it has been a roller coaster, right? From the day of, after 6:30 in the evening when it happened, me being very upset and angry that I was really just standing in the middle of the street interviewing somebody at a protest off to the side, away from the large group of protesters, and not feeling like I was doing anything or in a situation that merited being shot with a rubber bullet. Now, if there was something happening around me, I only knew the situation maybe, 3 or 4 feet in front of me, within my line of sight, right? So of course there could have been a lot of things happening around me. So and this happened to me in 2007 when I witnessed the LAPD's actions at that park. And I have to say that another reporter who I relieved at that time did get hit and pushed by an LAPD officer and did have to be hospitalized, and she ended up being okay. So after that incident, I replayed the situation in my head a lot. I ended up writing stories about that the next couple of days after it happened. So I find myself doing that now. I find myself reliving the situation and what happened. And so now I'm trying to come down from it and trying to kind of gear back up into going back to work and continuing the education coverage that I do next week. But I still need a few days to kind of just chill, relax, to practice a little mindfulness, a little meditation, go into a couple of the spiritual books and texts and teachings that I usually tap into. So I think that's kind of been the unexpected part, the up and down the last 4 days in terms of how I see this incident.
And I'm sure that's been difficult because reporters don't want to be the story. But I'm curious, do you see this experience as shaping or informing your work as an education reporter long-term moving forward?
I think within the day of the incident happening, I did have that thought, that question in my head about how did college influence the people who were out there at the protest? And when you're covering higher education, you're not just reporting about students who are freshmen to however long it takes for them to either get their degree or transfer or graduate. That's not. You're also reporting about the transition from high school into college. That's also a higher ed story. So I think it made me more focused on wanting to report on that transition. And it's a great time to do it right now because the K through 12 semester's over. We're going into the summertime. There's a lot of uncertainty. And that's what we do generally as journalists. We go and talk to people when they're at a crossroads in one way or another, right? They've achieved some special thing or something bad has happened to them. They've been in an accident. They're at a crossroads of some sort. So these high school graduates who have been accepted to college or plan, or maybe these protests are making them rethink their college plans one way or another. I think it is an important thing to ask and see what they're thinking.
Adolfo, you've been on the education beat for a very long time, and I'm wondering, why do you stick with it?
Well, when we were a smaller newsroom, I was covering education, mostly K through 12, and arts. So I was covering education, maybe, 75%, and then the arts, 25%. And I got started as an arts reporter. I loved doing album reviews, band reviews. When I was a freelancer starting out in San Diego, I was covering the, Mexican rock scene, and there was a big scene coming up in the mid to late 90s. So I was covering that, really liked it. And then at KPCC, I interviewed artists and writers, and LA has a very strong and long art scene. So I was faced with a choice of continuing to cover arts and do more of that, or covering education. And it was a tough choice, but education seemed to me like education is a stronger policy-driven topic. So how you go through the public school system or the first few years of your elementary school, middle school, and high school will shape and will do a lot to determine where you end up in life. And the policies that public institutions adopt to either support or identify your strengths and weaknesses and help you go through K through 12 and college, right, are very important, because ultimately that's it. It's the supports you have at home and at school to get a good education. So I felt, wow, I really like that.
I think you make a fair point that education is the beat that touches every other beat.
It really is. As an education reporter, you can do art stories. As an education reporter, you can do city hall stories. As an education reporter, you can do mayoral races and cover what candidates are doing, even races for governor. You can report on state superintendents of public instruction. You can do so much. You can cover, labor issues. You can cover health issues. There's just so much. I've covered science research as an education reporter. And once I figured that out, I realized, wow, this is it. I got to stay on this beat.
Well, I really appreciate your candor, Adolfo. And also, I just want to say I'd love to end this episode on an up note. And I'm wondering, is there something you're looking forward to in the coming days or weeks?
Yeah, my family makes challah bread on Fridays.
Carbs are always good.
So they've been getting good at it.
You're getting good at it, are you?
They are. It's my wife and my 9-year-old daughter. So it was really good last week. So they said they've got some new flour, some bread flour, something like that. And they let the dough rise a lot last week, more than the previous week. So I'm looking forward to that.
And we're looking forward to you being back on the beat. Adolfo Guzman-Lopez is the education correspondent for KPCC, Southern California Public Radio. Thank you again for making time for EWA Radio.
It was my pleasure.
And that wraps up another episode for us. If there's a story or a reporter you want to learn more about, drop us a line. We're at radio@ewa.org. The mission of the Education Writers Association is to strengthen the community of education journalists and improve the quality of education coverage. For more than 70 years, EWA has helped reporters get the story right. Have a great week, take care of yourselves, and thank you for listening.